Okay, welcome to the Western Heritage Center today. My name is Kevin Koisser, I'm the Executive Director, and we have a great program today on Victorian funeral customs, and I'm very proud to present a good friend of mine, Michelle Caron, who actually has been one of our longest serving volunteers at the museum. I think I actually posted a photo on Facebook about a week or so ago, picture of my daughter who was 1 year old at the time on my shoulder, and now she's 20, and Michelle was standing behind me in the photo. That's how long we've known each other. So, and Michelle has incredible skill set. She does a lot of our architectural walking tours for us, and is really detailed and understands how to present that. So if you get a chance next summer at least to do our architectural walking tours, I highly recommend it. And like I said, she has this passion for these Victorian funeral customs, and we're hoping we all learn from this so we can incorporate it somewhat into our cemetery tours that we also offer each year. So without further ado, I do want to mention also her husband, Conrad Caron, who also has been a long-term volunteer here. He's in the audience somewhere, and he's also now serving as a board member. So the Caron pair is very important to the Western Heritage Center. So without further ado, Michelle Caron.
Thank you, Kevin. That was very nice. I'd like to start by talking about funeral customs and mourning rites from other societies besides the Victorians. And these will give you some insight into how we folded these into our own customs, and as well as the Victorians. Some cultures see death as an attack upon their strength and unity. It disrupts their lives, brings danger to their midst, and makes them feel things they'd rather not. Mourning rites are very important in reuniting the group after the enemy, death, strikes at them. Mourning rites direct the spirit of the dead away from the living to clearly divide the living from the dead. Mourning rites help the spirit into the eternal world. Unless mourners perform certain rites, the dead cannot enter the next. After the body is reduced to a skeleton, the spirit in the eternal world no longer is dangerous. When the mourners are free, then the mourners are free to take up their everyday lives. Some cultures conclude this stage with celebrations and feasts, and the widow is allowed to remarry. There are 3 stages in mourning. The first stage is the immediate stage, which includes shock and grief, and the duration of that should last 1 to 3 months. Now, this is not Victorian parameters. These are from different cultures from the ancient world. Society may separate the mourners from the clan, and they may live in separate structures, wear mourning clothes like the Victorians did, forbid normal activities like feeding themselves, working, and playing. The transitional stage, the mourner is still grieving but beginning to cope, and when they finally accept the loss, they return to normal responsibilities. Some cultures believe sorcerers and magicians delight in death. Many cultures, especially hunting societies, believe death does not happen but is willed. Someone causes death, and all their anger may focus on the search for a murderer. Anger was aimed at the dead for leaving the living behind, causing the living so much pain and grief. Guilt is often associated with death. In China, a son was blamed for his father's death. If the son had loved and respected the father enough, the father would have lived longer. Love and fear are also strong feelings regarding death. Death can cause bad hunting, sickness, and death to others. Death could be caught like a disease and must be contained. This is why the dead must be burned, buried, or placed out of sight. A beloved relative's change after death, and his spirit may become harmful. The living must protect themselves from the corpse's gaze. Shutting or covering the eyes helps keep the dead from seeing where he is. Do not speak the name of the dead. It calls him back or makes him angry. A Lakota father of a dead child could keep the child's spirit by remaining calm and peaceful rather than angry or sad. Although a Christian should feel sorrowful, after a death, he should also feel the joy of knowing the spirit will go to heaven. A Roman family would call the name 3 times of the dead to make sure the individual was dead. A Jew's body was laid in an open sepulcher, the family returning the next 3 days for any signs of life. Then finally, the dead was buried. Australian Aborigines would cut themselves till they bled to show grief. Greeks would tear at their hair. Europeans during the Middle Ages would fall to the ground in a frenzy of grief. Egyptians, of course, mummified the dead so that the soul would become a lasting body to dwell in. Etruscan tombs were like houses, therefore the dead could live in the houses. Vikings placed wealthy dead on ships so they could sail to the homes of the gods, and during their cremation, the spirits would fly to the next world in the smoke. Tibetans let vultures consume the dead, believing the dead were empty shells. The spirit would be reborn in a new life no matter what happened to the body. Hunting societies would leave the dead exposed or in caves or in trees. Life moves on, does not stay in one place. Agricultural societies used burial most often, and that was part of a settled way of life. Class-divided societies used elaborate tombs. Nobles must live and find homes in death as well as life. Greeks and Etruscans believed the dead could not cross water. Don't take the dead out the same doorway the living use. Take the dead out a window, cut a hole in a wall, or build a special door for the dead. And in Victorian homes, a lot of times just a parlor door was used to take the dead out through the parlor. Parlors were usually used for social occasions only and to lay the dead out. So that door was used usually just for visitors and to carry the dead through. A mirror or water catches a soul. Ghosts cannot tolerate loud noises. Do we fire a military salute to honor the dead or scare the ghosts away? Do we ring church bells after a funeral or to scare the ghosts? Stones were rolled or placed in front of a tomb to keep the dead in. Modern headstones may be an adaptation of this concept. On All Souls' Day Eve, children would go door to door begging for soul cakes, which were eaten in remembrance of the dead or put on their graves. The Victorian preoccupation with death evolved from earlier attitudes. In 17th century Maryland and Virginia, half of all children never reached the age of 20. Rarely did adults live more than 40 years. Harsh mortality rates created both a resignation and a fear of death, which may have led to a lack of strong family ties. Symbols of fear commonly decorated headstones in the 18th century. Details like death's heads, crossed bones, and skulls decorated headstones. And you can see by this slide that these 2 brothers have the iconography of a skull with wings around them. These are 2 brothers who died at age 5 and 4. They were probably caught the same disease from each other. And I can't read the death date of the one on the left, but they probably died close to the same time. Death was very final in the 18th century. There wasn't really the idea that your soul would ascend to heaven. Changing attitudes towards death by the late 18th century can be attributed to the technological revolution of the Great Awakening. The theological revolution of the Great Awakening, which reinforced the belief that man might joyfully anticipate his own salvation. Death was, after all, perhaps an occasion for great joy or even reunification with family. Victorians were aware and interested in the spirit world and accepted the realm of the afterlife. Through mourning practices, Victorians accepted death and made it part of their daily lives. Rituals of grief and mourning have been practiced, after all, for thousands of years, and the Egyptians are a great example of that. In the Victorian era, death was no longer feared. What was feared was to have died undesired, to have lived undesired and died unlamented. It was very important for 19th century mourners to demonstrate openly their love and affection for the deceased. In the 1830s, it was popular for cemeteries to become park-like destinations for the living. One would encounter benches, urns, fencing, etc. to make the site seem more comfortable and home-like. These amenities were available so the living could contemplate both life and death. Some stones portrayed images of earthly comforts such as pillows, draperies, etc. And one of the first cemeteries in the country to exhibit this kind of homeness, I didn't say that right, but you know what I mean, is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this cemetery was developed in 1831. This is a detail of a fence around a cemetery. And it shows the weeping willow and lambs, and the weeping willow is a sign of resurrection. The lamb is a symbol for a child's death. There were extreme examples of headstones that demonstrated these earthly comforts, and one that took on the appearance, some took on the appearance of a bed. Here is a baby in a cradle with a lamb at the foot of the bed. There were thousands of these, thousands. And in our own Mount View Cemetery here in Billings, there are many, many, many gravestones that have lambs on the top of them, and almost all of them have been vandalized. Heaven and home became synonymous with cemetery iconography, including angels and images of the deceased souls being carried upward by winged angels. Now, this is not a headstone, of course, but this gives you the exact same feeling. This is St. Catherine being carried up to heaven by angels. Some of the iconography on cemetery headstones, I'll just give you a really brief list because there are many, many, many. Ivy on a headstone symbolized persistence and eternal life in the midst of death. Lilies represented purity. Rosebuds with a broken stem and lambs was the loss of a child. A sheaf of wheat represented an elderly person. A weeping willow was resurrection, and willow branches were sometimes carried at funerals. A tipped cross symbolized a cross being carried. 19th century Victorians divided the world into two spheres. Man's sphere, the outside world, which included business and fraternal organizations. Men could not stop their world to participate in mourning rituals for very long. They had to take care of the family in the outside world by earning a living. The woman's sphere was the home and the church, running the household, caring for children, and representing the family in times of mourning. Women, it seemed, had more time to contemplate and represent the family in mourning, and they did so to the nth degree. Although they varied widely, mourning rituals were included in most etiquette books in the 19th century. English guidelines for mourning were more elaborate than those practiced in the United States, probably the result of the Civil War. And here is a brief list of mourning, how to wear, what to wear during your mourning periods. And if you were the widow of a deceased man, you were in mourning for 2 years and a day. While the man, if there was a widower, he only mourned for 3 months, 3 to 4 months. And that was usually with a black armband and a black band around his hat. Death meant a scurry of activity in the home, windows covered with drapes. Whoops. Windows were covered and draped with crepe, black wreaths and silk and wax flowers were hung on the door and mantels. Hanging crepe announced to the neighbors the death in a family, and the neighbors would respond with food, etc. This is a photograph of Abraham Lincoln's house in Springfield, Illinois, and it shows his house draped in crepe, and it even shows his horse, Old Bob, out front of the house. That horse was the head of the procession during Lincoln's funeral procession to the cemetery where Lincoln was interred. Here's a very rare interior photograph of Lincoln's parlor in his home in Springfield, and this shows crepe hung from the ceiling as well as a center table draped in a black cloth. The very act of mourning well could earn a respect from the community. Acts of mourning earned respectability and demonstrated good character. Some women chose to mourn for the rest of their lives, like Queen Victoria, Mary Todd Lincoln, and Libby Custer. However, if a widow decided to remarry before her mourning period was complete for her first husband, she would continue to mourn with all its trappings immediately after her second marriage. And the reason to remarry while still in mourning usually meant that you needed the financial security for yourself and your children. And this is Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. They were madly in love with each other. Queen Victoria, who the era is named for, reigned from 1837 until 1901, when she died. American women looked at Queen Victoria, and as well as English women, looked at Queen Victoria as the essential family wife. She would eventually have 9 children. And Prince Albert would die probably of typhoid fever on December 14th, 1861, during the first year of the American Civil War. And American women looked to her for guidance in how to mourn. And here's Victoria in her mourning clothing. Now, she's breaking a lot of rules here because, after all, she is the Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India. She has very elaborate clothing on. Women in mourning did not wear elaborate clothing. They wore very plain clothing that had no sheen, no details to them. She's got a lot of jewelry on. That too was not protocol. She's got her white widow's cap on, but Queen Victoria did what Queen Victoria wanted to do. And since she basically invented mourning, during this period, she could do what she wanted. And here's Mary Todd Lincoln in mourning. This is for Willie Lincoln. Willie Lincoln died probably also of typhoid fever from drinking the water from the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. She too is sort of stretching the rules here. She's got pretty elaborate clothing on. She's got a suite of jewelry on. She's First Lady of the United States, and Mary Todd has definitely a mind of her own. This is in 1863. She was absolutely prostrate after Willie died, and it would only be about a year and a half when Lincoln died. So she became a professional mourner as well. Here are some photographs of women in mourning as they marry their second husband. And you can see the white on their clothing. The woman on the left is wearing something, it's either called a fichu or a bertha, I forget which, but it's that crossed white garment across her chest. They're both wearing veils. I think they're probably wearing orange blossoms in their hair. Those guys that married them knew they were going to stay in mourning. They had probably a whole nother year to go, but those women needed husbands, and those husbands probably needed wives. They probably had children of their own that needed a mother. Spiritualism was very popular and an accepted occupation for a woman. Seances were practiced in the White House by Mary Todd Lincoln. She even talked Lincoln into participating a few times. Many women found comfort in these practices, and it was a reaction to all the death in the Civil War. This is a really famous photograph of Mary Todd with Lincoln's figure hovering over her with his hands on her shoulders. And you couldn't see this while you were in the room getting your photograph taken, but somehow it mysteriously showed up when the picture was delivered to you. And here's another spirit photograph of a really, really sad woman in mourning with, I'm guessing that's her daughter. And the little insignature on the right is just showing you that a female photographer took this picture. Very uncommon. It was considered bad luck for a woman in deep mourning to attend a wedding. If necessary, she could sit aside deep mourning or literally keep from being seen at the ceremony. Queen Victoria did this for one of her son's weddings. She sat in a viewing box isolated from other wedding guests, especially the bride, and did not attend the reception. One of the few people that was able to get Victoria out of her sequester was Buffalo Bill, of all people. In 1887, he was able to, or she had a command performance of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show in England, and she attended and loved it. So Buffalo Bill got her out of the doldrums. Servants were expected to enter mourning for the death of their employees and slaves for their masters, and remain in mourning as long as the family did. The picture on the left is a rare photograph of a slave girl in mourning, and the picture on the right is a photograph of an adolescent boy in mourning, and notice he's just got on a black armband. This is a poor little fellow who is ill. His parents are probably aware that he's dying, and I want to read a quote, not necessarily attached to this photograph, but is appropriate for it. This is about Bertie Carpenter, 1890. He had been an intense but patient little sufferer for a long time before his death, which was really not death, but a release from suffering and pain into life and happiness. His remains were sweetly placed in the bosom of the earth, where he will be rocked in God's great cradle during his peaceful sleep. And that's important, his peaceful sleep. Victorians thought of death as sleep, not death, but sleep. Mourning photography was a booming business during the Victorian period, especially from the Civil War on, when photography became less expensive, and albumin prints and carte de visites and all these other less expensive forms of photography were available to regular people. Mourning photographers advertised this speciality, and some bodies were taken to studios, others were done in the home. Infants were especially photographed because it was usually their first photo, was their death photo. And here's a photograph of I guess you could call that a toddler, with a poem to go with it. And here's another quote about an unmarried adult woman. But when her daughter Flora died, serenity gave way to despair. Death was accepted twice during life, before it began in earnest and after it was over. Little children died. Death deprived them of nothing. Their mothers were strong and could bear it. Those who were old belonged to death as if by contract, but the death of a lovely unmarried girl was intolerable and against nature. So their attitude was, even though it was horrible, children hadn't begun their lives yet, and it was a little more easier to bear than if an adult woman who hadn't really begun her married life yet, it was more of a tragedy. And here is a child in death in a basket. Oops. The woman on the left really strikes me. The look on her face, she just looks devastated by the death of this baby. Really sort of a haunting photograph to me. And then the child on the right is in her cradle, his or her cradle. I can't tell if that's a boy or a girl. This next photograph is very unusual. It shows a pregnant woman, a photograph of a pregnant woman. I'm very surprised by that. And then it shows her later with that child in death. The photograph on the top left is also a little unusual. It shows a father holding the dead child. Probably that child's mother died in childbirth, and that child lived a little bit longer and eventually succumbed to some illness. And the photograph on the bottom right shows twins in white coffins with the family photographed with them. Posthumous photographs. They put the funeral pictures right alongside the rest in the family album. Everyone had a center table with shelves. They'd put the album on top and the family Bible on the bottom. When company came, they'd sit down and open the album. It was the polite thing. They'd turn the album pages, and every once in a while the company would say something about how long Arthur's hair had been when he was little, or how they hadn't seen the picture in ages, or how sweet the baby looked and which one was it, since they knew you'd lost little Robert and Lawrence and Ida. So that gives you an idea of how devastating the mortality rate was. Here's a photograph of siblings at the same photography studio. You can tell by the chair and the carpeting. The photo on the left shows a live sibling, and the photo on the right shows the sibling tied to the chair so that the child can sit up and look almost natural. This photograph is of the children surrounding the Christmas tree with their dead siblings' portrait in the background. So they wanted to include that child in the Christmas photo. And these photographs a lot of times were in postcards. They were made into postcards so that family could send these postcards of these dead children's photographs to other family members, announcing the death of that child, and also so that those family members could see a picture of those children for the very first time, because that was usually the first time they had their photograph taken. Now this is out of the Victorian era, but I just wanted to show you that this is a photograph from the 1930s, that this practice of taking photographs of mothers holding their dead babies was still being practiced. And just as an aside, vernacularly, I just saw in People magazine, so you know what my reading tastes go to, pictures of John Legend's deceased child being held in his wife's arms. So this is still being done today. In the South, it was common for a body to be laid out in bed. Family and servants kept a 24-hour vigil, and servants usually stayed late at night with the bodies. These were called wakes, and it was taken from the word awake, and you stayed awake to keep the mice out of the coffins. Flowers help mask the odor of the decaying body. Unprecedented casualties during the Civil War altered mourning practices throughout the country. It was simply impractical for women to sequester themselves away when they were often the head of their families while their husbands had been killed in battle. These women were also needed as nurses, etc. And here's a photograph of a Civil War burial ground. I don't know if that's a Union or a Confederate burial ground. It's in Virginia. And it's just from the bottom of the photo to the horizon, from one side of the photo to the other side. The old estimate used to be about 620,000 men died in the war. They now have it up to about 850,000. So it was unprecedented. It still is unprecedented. And here's a photograph of headboards for men who were killed in Gettysburg. This is a picture of women mourning Stonewall Jackson's death. Stonewall Jackson was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. He was killed by one of his own men accidentally. He was shot in the arm. He lived for a few days, but they amputated his arm. His arm became gangrenous, and he died from that wound. And it was devastating for the South. This picture depicts the ruins of Richmond, Virginia, and I want you to notice the two spectral figures in the bottom right. Those are women in mourning in all their widow's weeds, and the term widow's weeds comes from women wearing crepe, and their veils were made of crepe. Crepe was a kind of fabric that sort of rotted away and became raggedy, and that's where the term widow's weeds came from. And if you look at the figure on the far left, that is not a ghost. That is simply a man who moved while the photograph was being taken. So full disclaimer here, no ghost. All right, this is a picture of Arlington House. Arlington House was Robert E. Lee's home. It was his wife's ancestral home. She was related to George Washington by her mother. Montgomery Meigs was the quartermaster general of the Union Army, and they were running out of burial grounds for the Union dead. So I don't know if it was out of spite or just out of convenience. Montgomery Meigs said, I know, let's bury the Union dead in Robert E. Lee's front lawn. So this is where Arlington National Cemetery begins. This is an advertisement for transportation cases, metal caskets, and this was to transport Union officers or some very fortunate enlisted men in metal cases so their bodily fluids didn't leak out and cause a lot of problems. And here's an advertisement for undertaking. That was sort of coming into its own during the Civil War. And this is a man being embalmed. Usually just officers were returned to their homes for burial. Enlisted men were buried where they fell and later on collected and put into cemeteries by women's organizations. Clara Barton took that on as one of her later in years projects. But officers were usually the only ones that were transported back to their homes. Many women actually set aside their grief and deep mourning as a coping mechanism during the Civil War and dealt with their emotions after the war ended. Perhaps this is why so many women reacted violently to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in reaction to their grief that they had been suppressing in regards to their own families. And here's an announcement of Lincoln's death. There is only one photograph that survives of Lincoln dead in his casket, and this is it. Uh, Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War, and he was in charge of Lincoln's body while it went from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, and he forbid Lincoln to be photographed in death. This photograph, he broke all the plates of a man who did take these photographs, except one survived. It was found in a book or a file, I forget which, in a library by a researcher, I think in the 1950s or 60s. So this is a recent find. And if any of you saw the program 2 weeks ago about the Lincoln death photograph, there is now one more photograph of Lincoln in death. Here is a photograph of Lincoln being memorialized. I think this is in Cleveland, Ohio, or Columbus, Ohio. I forget which city in Ohio. But look at that elaborate thing there. I don't know what to call that. And here is Lincoln being whisked up to heaven by God and angels. The thing I want you to notice is the Indian at the corner, the bottom right corner. No Indians mourned for Lincoln. No Indians were mourning for Lincoln. This is the father of the country, helping Lincoln up to heaven, the savior of the country. Mourning became big business. Everything was in black. Straight pins, safety pins, calling cards, stationery, crepe veils, clothing, undergarments, you name it. Everything was manufactured for mourning purposes. Here's a photograph of 3 children. The one on the left is in complete mourning. That baby's mother probably died giving birth to that child. The other 2 are just showing their grief with black sashes around their waists. I wouldn't doubt that those are well, the one in the middle is probably a boy. A boy usually has its hair parted down the middle. A girl does not, so that's how you can tell them apart. They've dressed them in dresses until they were potty trained, so it's hard to tell boys from girls for a few years. And here's a picture of a widow in weeds, completely in black. Notice how dull her clothing is. There's practically no ornamentation. I think the only jewelry she's wearing is a chatelaine with maybe a cross, or maybe that's a key. The woman on the left is Queen Alexandria, Prince Edward's wife, or Prince Albert's wife, excuse me. And the other 2 women are just simply to show how other women mourned. Here's an example of black stationery and a black calling card, a black fan, black edged handkerchiefs. Now these are tear catchers. People actually caught their tears in these little vials and saved them. These date all the way back to the Roman times, and Victorians used them as well. Hair work. Hair work was extremely popular during the Civil War period, and I'm talking about literally taking the deceased person's hair and making it into jewelry, wreaths, corsages, rings, you name it. Earrings, you name it. Jewelry was especially restricted. It was not supposed to draw attention to yourself. No shiny jewelry, no beautiful clothing. This is a catalog, this is a catalog where you can buy the components to make hair. You can even buy hair, but the whole purpose was to use the hair of the deceased person and sometimes your own hair. Women would save their hair in what's called a hair receiver or a hair receptacle and work that almost like tatting into jewelry. This is a request for hair. Hair work was a cottage industry. It was worth a lot of money. Hair was worth 4 times the price of sterling silver during the Civil War. And here's the front of the catalog, the tools that you need. They had little bitty, teeny tiny curling irons. And here's an example of some hair work. The rings at the top left are made from human hair. Rings were given out at funerals as memorials for the dead. The oval piece in the center is an example of 2 people's hair woven together. And then there's a cross with the hair. Here are some gorgeous pieces. It's called tube work. I don't know how that's made, but I think it's gorgeous. Hair work is a beautiful art form. Some people find it really disgusting, really creepy. I think it's beautiful. Here is tube work in a necklace. Here's a pendant on the left and a necklace. The center part of that necklace has what's called a Prince Albert curl. The sheaf of wheat is made from ivory, and as we discussed before, that is to demonstrate mourning for an elderly person. The piece in the middle with the fully opened rose probably designates grief for a young woman, and the piece on the far left is a button containing hair. Here's a watch chain with hair, made from hair. I want to talk just a little bit about what was practiced in Billings. At the turn of the century, it was common for people in Billings to have their corpse embalmed in their homes. The Yellowstone County Museum has a very interesting artifact. It's a big, long, narrow wicker basket that was used to take the dead from the house to the funeral home. Very interesting artifact. I have no idea if it's on display, but it used to be. Funerals and wakes were often held in the home of the deceased well into the 20th century. Morticians came to the homes to embalm the bodies behind the closed doors of a bedroom. The blood drained from a corpse was contained in a large glass bottle and was later poured into the sewer by the mortician. This blood was emptied into the Yellowstone River where drinking water came from. Families sometimes dug the graves themselves. They were responsible for mowing, weeding, and planting flowers and bushes. The Smith Funeral Home's horses to pull the hearses with were housed in a brick stable behind the funeral home. The Smith horses were also used by the Maverick Hose Company because A. Herman Smith, who founded the Smith Funeral Chapel in 1896, was also the assistant fire chief and later chief of the Maverick Hose Company. He had the fire alarms come to the chapel, which were then relayed to the Maverick Hose Company. They shared the same horses. The stables were torn down in 1976 to make room for a parking lot, and bricks were found painted with the horses' name, George and Sam. So I hope that you've been able to see some of these similarities with ancient customs from the Victorian era, and some of the things that we do today. We dress in black when we go to a funeral. Oftentimes we bring food. We send flower honorariums. We do a lot of the things the Victorians did. We just don't know where those customs came from. Well, now you know that they came from Victorian era, if not even further back. And here's Queen Victoria with her children who are in mourning for Albert still. They mourned forever, just like she did. And the photograph on the right shows her children around a bust of Prince Albert. Beyond being a visual display what could be morbidly interpreted as a celebration of death, for the Victorians it was a celebration of the love they shared with one another and a celebration of the spirit world they continually sought. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. You mentioned how isolated at public events. Why? Why would somebody in mourning have to be isolated from the general public in general? Is there a relationship that goes both ways?
It was bad luck.
It's just bad luck.
Bad luck. It was very bad luck for her to be seen at a wedding. The bride should not see her. That's why she was isolated away in a booth or box. It was just bad luck to look upon somebody who was mourning for the dead.
Do you know you talked about the Smith Funeral Chapel with the stable for the horses? Was that the one that was downtown?
Yeah, it was downtown. Kevin,
then it moved down.
yeah, it moved. It was where that parking lot is. Is it on 3rd or 2nd? And
I remember it down there.
Second.
yeah, I remember
That
it.
was the actual original from back in the 1800s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
remember it too. And they kept their horses there when it wasn't at the Maverick Hose Company. When they weren't at the
I
Maverick
remember
Hose
the
Company.
horses.
Yeah, I don't know when they got rid of the
I remember
horses,
location, though.
but I think it's cool that they still had their names on the bricks down there.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about jewelry not being worn, but wasn't there actual jewelry being made specifically for mourning? Like
Right.
gutta percha and
Yes, gutta
jewelry
percha,
of jet?
gutta percha, jet, the hair work. You could wear things that weren't shiny. You could wear your wedding ring, a gold wedding ring. You could wear that. And black jewelry. And when you went into different stages of mourning, you could wear different colors of jewelry, like amethyst, because the purple represented, harkened back to ecclesiastical things, garnets and rubies, but especially amethysts. And that was during second period mourning, late mourning. It's all very complicated. That's why they had books. They had to have books. They couldn't keep it straight either. So they went by etiquette books.
I'm curious also about the embalming process. You said in the 1800s that becomes very popular. Why? Why does embalming become part of actually what we're shifting away from that now, but for 100+ years. So.
Well, it grew in popularity because of the amount of officers that were being killed in the Civil War, and the officers were the ones that were able to go to be transferred back to their home cemeteries. And before that, it wasn't common. You buried somebody pretty quickly. But when you were killed on a battlefield far from home, they needed to embalm those bodies to ship them back by rail or by wagon to get them home without the body just decomposing completely.
Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. So.